Captain Sarah Mitchell pressed her face against the cold metal of the cockpit window, watching the enemy convoy snake through the valley below like a deadly serpent. 35 tanks moved in perfect formation, their cannons gleaming in the morning sun. The sight should have filled her with dread, but instead, a strange calm settled over her shoulders. The radio crackled to life in her headset. Eagle 1. This is command. You are to abort the mission immediately. Repeat. Abort and return to base. Sarah's jaw tightened. She had been flying combat missions for 3 years, longer than most pilots in her squadron. She knew what she was looking at down there, and she knew what it meant for the ground forces advancing from the east. If that convoy reached the mountain pass by nightfall, hundreds of her fellow soldiers would walk into a massacre. Command, this is Eagle 1. I have a clear shot at the convoy. Requesting permission to engage. The response came back sharp and immediate. Negative, Eagle 1. Intelligence reports indicate heavy anti-aircraft defenses. No pilot could successfully strike that convoy and survive. Return to base now. Sarah pulled her fighter jet into a wide circle, keeping the convoy in sight. Below, the tanks continued their relentless march toward the pass. She watched the lead tank commander standing in his turret, probably feeling safe in his mobile fortress. He had no idea that death was circling 3,000 feet above his head. The daughter of a small-town mechanic, Sarah had grown up with grease under her fingernails and the smell of motor oil in her hair. Her father had taught her that every machine had a weakness. Every engine had a breaking point. Tanks were just big, slow machines when you really thought about it. Eagle 1. Acknowledge abort order immediately. Sarah reached up and switched off her radio. The sudden silence in the cockpit felt like stepping into a cathedral. She was alone now, 3,000 feet above enemy territory, with nothing but her training and instincts to guide her. She banked the aircraft sharply to the left, studying the convoy's formation. The tanks were spaced perfectly for road travel, but that same spacing made them vulnerable to aerial attack. If she came in low and fast from the north, she could hit the lead vehicles before the anti-aircraft guns could track her movement. The fuel gauge showed she had enough for 1 attack run, maybe 2 if she was lucky. After that, she would have to hope she could make it back to friendly territory before the engine quit. Sarah pushed the control stick forward, sending the fighter into a shallow dive. The convoy grew larger in her windscreen, individual details becoming visible. She could see soldiers walking alongside the tanks, their rifles slung casually across their shoulders. They thought they were safe. They thought no pilot would be crazy enough to attack such a heavily defended target. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first burst of anti-aircraft fire erupted around her plane like deadly fireworks. Black puffs of smoke appeared in her peripheral vision, each one representing a shell that had missed her by mere feet. Sarah gritted her teeth and held her course. The lead tank was dead center in her targeting system now, growing larger by the second. Her finger hovered over the trigger. Everything her instructors had taught her about aerial combat flashed through her mind in an instant. Altitude, airspeed, target acquisition, escape route. She had run this scenario 100 times in training, but never with real bullets flying at her. The tank commander below finally noticed the approaching aircraft. Sarah could see him pointing upward, his mouth open in what was probably a shout of warning. Too late. She was already committed to the attack run. The first rocket left her wing mount with a whoosh of flame and smoke. Sarah didn't wait to see where it hit. She was already lining up the second target, her hands moving across the controls with practiced precision. Another rocket, another target, another chance to stop this convoy before it reached the pass. Explosions bloomed across the valley floor like orange flowers. The lead tank disappeared in a ball of fire and twisted metal. The second tank lurched to a stop, black smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Soldiers scattered in all directions, abandoning their positions as death rained down from above. But Sarah wasn't finished. Not even close. She pulled the fighter into a steep climb, using every bit of power the engine could give her. The anti-aircraft guns swiveled desperately, trying to track her movement, but she was already banking around for another pass. The convoy had broken formation now, tanks spreading out across the valley floor like startled cattle. That was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. Scattered targets were easier to hit than a coordinated formation. She selected her next victim, a heavy tank that had pulled off the road and was trying to hide behind a cluster of boulders. The second attack run came in from the east, with the sun at her back. Sarah hoped the glare would make it harder for the gunners to track her approach. She dropped even lower this time, skimming just above the treetops. Branches scraped against her landing gear as she roared over the forest. The hidden tank never saw her coming. Sarah's rocket hit it square in the turret, sending the massive gun barrel spinning through the air like a piece of scrap metal. The explosion was so violent it knocked two nearby soldiers off their feet, but the anti-aircraft fire was getting closer now. Sarah could hear metal fragments pinging off her fuselage. A warning light flashed red on her instrument panel, indicating damage to the hydraulic system. She had to make every shot count from here on out. The third pass targeted a cluster of 3 tanks that had formed a defensive triangle in an open field. Sarah came at them from the north, flying so low that her jet wash kicked up clouds of dust and debris. The tanks opened fire with their main guns, trying to bring down the aircraft that was tearing their convoy apart. Tank shells whistled past her cockpit, missing by inches. One round passed so close that Sarah could feel the heat from the explosion. Her hands were steady on the controls, but her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She fired both remaining rockets simultaneously, watching them streak toward the clustered tanks like twin comets. The first one punched through the side armor of the middle tank, detonating inside the crew compartment. The second rocket hit the fuel tank of another vehicle, creating an inferno that spread to the third tank in seconds. Sarah pulled up hard, pushing the fighter to its limits. The G-forces pressed her deep into her seat, making it difficult to breathe. Behind her, the valley was becoming a graveyard of burning metal and scattered equipment. But she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The radio crackled back to life as she reached altitude. Command had been trying to reach her for the past 10 minutes. Eagle 1, respond immediately. What is your status? Sarah looked down at the chaos below. Smoke columns rose from a dozen burning vehicles. Soldiers were running in all directions, abandoning equipment and vehicles in their panic to escape. The carefully organized convoy had become a scene of complete destruction, but there were still more than 20 tanks down there, and some of them were already reorganizing. The mission wasn't over. It was just getting started. Command, this is Eagle 1. Convoy engagement in progress. Requesting immediate resupply and backup. The silence on the radio lasted for nearly 30 seconds. When the controller finally responded, his voice was filled with disbelief. Eagle 1, did you just say you engaged the convoy? How many vehicles have you destroyed? Sarah counted the burning wrecks below. 12 confirmed kills, Command. But I'm not finished yet. The fuel warning light had been blinking for 5 minutes, but Sarah ignored it. She had more pressing concerns than an empty tank. Below her, the surviving enemy vehicles were trying to regroup near a small village at the eastern edge of the valley. If they managed to organize a proper defense, her next attack run would be suicide. She banked the fighter sharply to the right, studying the new formation through her targeting scope. The remaining tank commanders had learned from watching their comrades die. They had positioned their vehicles in a staggered pattern that would make it difficult for a single aircraft to hit multiple targets. Smart, but not smart enough. The radio buzzed with urgent chatter from command. Eagle 1, fuel depot reports your reserve tank should be nearly empty. Return to base immediately for refueling and rearming. Sarah switched the radio to a different frequency. She didn't have time for arguments with desk officers who had never seen combat. The enemy convoy was reforming, and every minute she spent listening to orders was another minute they had to dig in and prepare defenses. She pushed the control stick forward, beginning another descent toward the valley floor. This time she approached from the south, using a ridgeline to mask her approach until the last possible moment. The element of surprise was the only advantage she had left. As she crested the ridge, the village spread out before her like a tactical map. The tanks had taken positions around the buildings, using the structures as cover. Soldiers moved between the vehicles, setting up anti-aircraft guns and preparing defensive positions. They expected her to come back. They were ready for her, but ready and able were two different things. Sarah selected her first target, a heavy tank positioned near the village church. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to destroy a war machine next to a house of worship. War had its own twisted sense of humor. The first rocket streaked down from the ridge, hitting the tank before the crew even knew they were under attack. The explosion shattered the church windows and sent debris flying in all directions. Civilians who had been hiding in the building came running out, screaming and pointing at the sky. Sarah felt a stab of guilt as she watched the villagers flee. These were innocent people caught in the middle of someone else's war. But if she didn't stop this convoy here, Many more innocent people would die when the tanks reached the mountain pass. The anti-aircraft fire started immediately this time. The enemy gunners had learned to track fast-moving targets, and their shells were getting uncomfortably close. One explosion rocked Sarah's aircraft so violently that she nearly lost control. Warning lights flashed across her instrument panel like a Christmas tree. She lined up her second target, another heavy tank that had taken position behind a stone farmhouse. The building provided good cover from ground attack, but it couldn't protect the tank from aerial assault. Sarah's rocket punched through the farmhouse roof and detonated inside the tank's crew compartment. The explosion was so powerful it brought down half the farmhouse. Sarah hoped no civilians had been hiding inside, but there was no way to know for sure. War was about impossible choices, and she had made hers. A new voice came over the radio, speaking with the authority of high command. "Captain Mitchell, this is General Harrison. You are ordered to break off your attack immediately and return to base." "That is a direct order." Sarah recognized the voice. General Harrison had been her squadron commander before his promotion to division headquarters. He was a good man who genuinely cared about his pilots, but he didn't understand what was at stake down in that valley. "General, with respect, I have the enemy convoy pinned down and disorganized. If I break off now, they'll regroup and continue their advance. Our ground forces will be slaughtered. Captain, you're flying on fumes with a damaged aircraft against overwhelming odds. This is not heroism, this is suicide. Come home now." "And that's an order." Sarah looked down at her fuel gauge. The needle was hovering just above empty. The general was right about one thing. She was flying on fumes, but she still had rockets left, and there were still targets down there. "I'm sorry, General, but I can't do that." She switched off the radio completely this time, cutting all communication with command. The sudden silence was both terrifying and liberating. She was truly on her own now, with nothing but her skill and determination to see her through. The third attack run came in low over the village cemetery, a grim irony that wasn't lost on her. Sarah weaved between the headstones, using the monuments as cover from the anti-aircraft fire. Bullets and shell fragments pinged off the ancient marble, chipping centuries-old inscriptions. Her target was a group of 3 medium tanks that had clustered around the village well. The crews were frantically trying to camouflage their vehicles with branches and canvas, but there was no hiding from Sarah's eagle eyes. She had been hunting these machines for over an hour now, and she could spot them anywhere. The rocket hit the lead tank squarely in the engine compartment, sending a geyser of burning fuel high into the air. The explosion ignited the camouflage material on the other 2 tanks, creating a wall of flame that forced their crews to abandon their positions. Sarah pulled up sharply, clearing the village rooftops by mere feet. Behind her, ammunition began cooking off inside the burning tanks, sending tracer rounds streaking in all directions like deadly fireworks. The remaining enemy soldiers dove for cover as their own shells exploded around them, but the anti-aircraft fire was taking its toll. Sarah felt the aircraft shudder as another shell burst nearby. This time, fragments punched through the fuselage and into the cockpit. She felt a sharp pain in her left shoulder where a piece of shrapnel had found its mark. Blood soaked through her flight suit, but Sarah forced herself to ignore the wound. She still had work to do. The fuel gauge was touching empty now, and she could feel the engine beginning to sputter. She had maybe 1 more attack run left, 2 if the aviation gods were feeling generous. Below, the remaining tanks were scattered across the village in small groups, their crews probably hoping that dispersal would make them harder to target. They were wrong. Scattered targets just meant Sarah could pick them off one by one, without worrying about concentrated anti-aircraft fire. She spotted her next victim hiding behind the village school, its cannon pointed skyward in a futile attempt to track her movement. Sarah came in from the east, using the school building itself as cover until the last second. The tank crew never saw her coming. The rocket hit with devastating precision, turning the vehicle into a bonfire of twisted metal. Unfortunately, the explosion also set fire to the school building. Sarah watched with growing horror as flames spread across the roof and through the windows. She prayed that the building was empty, that all the children had been evacuated when the fighting started. The engine coughed once, twice, then resumed its steady rumble. Sarah knew she was living on borrowed time now. Every second that passed brought her closer to becoming another casualty in this endless war. But she wasn't finished yet. There were still tanks down there, still threats to eliminate. She banked around for another pass, counting the remaining targets. 18 tanks were still operational, spread out across the village and surrounding fields. That was 18 too many. Each one of those machines carried enough firepower to devastate an infantry company. Each one represented dozens of potential casualties among her own forces. The next attack came in from the north, following the village's main road like a guided missile. Sarah flew so low that her landing gear nearly scraped the cobblestones. Windows exploded in her wake as the supersonic shockwave shattered glass throughout the village. Her target was a command tank positioned in the village square, its radio antennas marking it as a high-value target. If she could eliminate the command vehicle, the remaining tanks would lose coordination and become even easier to pick off. The rocket found its mark with deadly accuracy. The command tank disappeared in a massive explosion that sent debris flying across the square. The blast was so powerful it cracked the foundation of the nearby town hall and shattered every window within 100 yards. Sarah pulled up hard, pushing her damaged aircraft to its absolute limits. Behind her, the village square was a scene of complete devastation. The fountain in the center of the square had been destroyed, and water mixed with burning fuel to create an eerie orange glow. But her victory was short-lived. As she climbed away from the village, Sarah heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The unmistakable whistle of an incoming surface-to-air missile. The enemy had finally brought their heavy anti-aircraft weapons to bear. The missile streaked past her cockpit, missing by less than 10 feet. Sarah threw the aircraft into a violent barrel roll, trying to break the lock that she knew was coming from the second missile. But with her damaged controls and nearly empty fuel tank, the fighter responded sluggishly to her commands. The second missile found its mark. The explosion tore through the aircraft's tail section, sending Sarah into an uncontrolled spin. Alarms screamed in her headset as system after system failed. The control stick felt dead in her hands, and smoke was beginning to fill the cockpit. For a moment, Sarah considered reaching for the ejection handle. She had done enough damage to the convoy to justify bailing out and hoping for rescue. But as the aircraft spun toward the earth, she caught sight of the village below. There were still 17 tanks down there, and if she ejected now, they would regroup and continue their advance. Her father had always told her that when a machine broke down, you didn't abandon it. You found a way to make it work. Sarah was about to put that philosophy to the ultimate test. She fought against the spin, using every trick she had learned in flight training. Slowly, painfully, she began to regain control of the aircraft. The tail was gone and the hydraulics were shot, but the engine was still running. That meant she still had options. Sarah looked down at the village one more time. 17 tanks, 17 chances to save the lives of her fellow soldiers, 17 reasons to keep fighting even when the odds said she should quit. The fuel gauge read empty now, but the engine kept running. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, machines were just like people. They found ways to keep going even when logic said they should stop. The damaged fighter aircraft limped through the sky like a wounded bird, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid. Sarah could feel every vibration through the control stick as her crippled machine struggled to stay airborne. The tail section was completely gone. The hydraulics were failing, and the fuel tank was reading below empty. By all rights, she should have been dead already. But Sarah Mitchell had never been one to follow the rules about what should or shouldn't be possible. Below her, the remaining 17 tanks had spread out across the valley, their crews probably thinking they had finally driven off the crazy pilot who had been terrorizing them for the past hour. They were repositioning for their continued advance toward the mountain pass, unaware that their tormentor was still very much in the fight. Sarah wiped blood from her eyes where shrapnel had cut her forehead during the missile strike. Her left shoulder throbbed where another fragment had punched through her flight suit, but she could still move her arm. That was all that mattered. As long as she could work the controls, she could still fight. The radio crackled back to life on the emergency frequency. Static-filled voices were calling her designation, demanding status reports, ordering her to acknowledge. Sarah reached over and turned the volume down until the voices became a distant whisper. She didn't want to hear about orders or protocols right now. She had work to finish. She banked the aircraft toward a cluster of 3 tanks that had taken position near a small farm outside the village. The crews were probably feeling safe now that they had some distance from the burning wreckage in the town square. They were about to learn that nowhere was safe when Sarah Mitchell was hunting. The approach was rough and unsteady. Without proper tail control, Sarah had to use differential engine power and the remaining control surfaces to steer her aircraft. It was like trying to thread a needle while riding a bucking horse. But she had trained for this. Every pilot learned how to fly damaged aircraft, though few ever had to put those lessons to practical use. Her first rocket of this attack run screamed toward the lead tank, which was positioned behind a stone barn. The crew saw her coming this time and tried to traverse their main gun to track her approach, but tank turrets moved slowly compared to fighter aircraft. The rocket hit before they could bring their cannon to bear. The explosion tore through the barn like paper, sending burning hay and debris flying in all directions. The tank itself was lifted off the ground by the blast, its tracks spinning uselessly in the air before it crashed back down as a burning wreck. Sarah lined up the second tank, which was trying to escape across an open field. The crew had abandoned any pretense of fighting back and was simply running for their lives. Sarah almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Then she remembered the intelligence reports about what this convoy was planning to do to her fellow soldiers at the mountain pass. The second rocket found its mark in the tank's rear armor, the weakest point on the vehicle. The explosion gutted the crew compartment and sent the turret flying through the air like a toy. The tank rolled to a stop in a shallow creek, steam rising where the burning metal met the cold water. But as Sarah pulled up from the attack run, she felt the engine begin to sputter. The fuel was finally running out, and no amount of willpower could change the laws of physics. She had maybe 2 more minutes of flight time. 3 if she was incredibly lucky. That meant she had to make every shot count. She spotted a group of 4 tanks clustered around a crossroads about a mile south of the village. They were positioned to control the intersection, probably planning to ambush any ground forces that tried to approach from that direction. Sarah decided to deny them that opportunity. The approach was the most dangerous one yet. Without tail control, and with a failing engine, Sarah had to come in fast and low, using speed to compensate for her aircraft's deteriorating flight characteristics. She streaked across the landscape barely 50 feet off the ground, her jet wash flattening crops and sending farm animals scattering in terror. The tank crews at the crossroads spotted her at the last second. Anti-aircraft fire erupted around her aircraft like deadly hail, but Sarah held her course. One of the tanks fired its main gun directly at her, the massive shell missing by mere yards. The explosion behind her was close enough to rock the aircraft violently. Sarah fired 2 rockets in rapid succession, targeting the largest tanks in the group. The first rocket punched through the side armor of a heavy battle tank, detonating the ammunition storage and creating an explosion that could be seen for miles. The second rocket hit a medium tank in the engine compartment, setting off a chain reaction that spread to a nearby fuel truck. The crossroads became an inferno of burning vehicles and scattered equipment. Sarah pulled up sharply, but the damaged aircraft responded sluggishly. She was losing altitude fast, and the engine was making ominous noises that suggested total failure was imminent. 13 tanks left, 13 chances to save lives, 13 reasons to keep fighting. Sarah scanned the valley, looking for her next targets. Most of the remaining tanks had gone to ground, hiding behind buildings and natural cover. Their crews had finally realized they were dealing with a pilot who simply refused to quit, no matter how impossible the odds became. She spotted 2 tanks trying to escape through a narrow canyon on the eastern edge of the valley. They were moving fast, probably hoping to reach friendly territory before the crazy pilot in the damaged aircraft could catch up with them. Sarah decided to dash their hopes. The canyon approach was treacherous even for an undamaged aircraft. With her crippled fighter, it was borderline suicidal. The canyon walls rose on both sides, leaving little room for maneuvering if she encountered anti-aircraft fire, but it also meant the tanks had nowhere to run if she could get a clear shot. Sarah dove into the canyon like a hawk stooping on prey. The rocky walls flashed past her wingtips as she threaded the narrow passage at maximum speed. Ahead, she could see the 2 tanks racing along the canyon floor, their crews probably praying they could reach the exit before death caught up with them. The first tank tried to hide behind a boulder field, but Sarah's rocket found it anyway. The explosion brought down half the canyon wall, burying the wreckage under tons of stone. The second tank made it almost to the canyon exit before Sarah's next rocket caught it in the rear deck, turning it into scrap metal. 11 tanks remaining, but as Sarah pulled up out of the canyon, the engine finally gave up. The steady rumble that had carried her through the entire battle died with a mechanical wheeze, leaving only the whistle of wind over metal. She was now flying a very expensive glider with a very short flight time remaining. Sarah looked at her altimeter. She had maybe 2,000 feet of altitude left, which translated to roughly 3 minutes of gliding time. After that, she would have to put the aircraft down somewhere, assuming she could find a suitable landing spot in enemy territory, or she could use those 3 minutes to finish what she had started. The remaining 11 tanks had regrouped in a defensive circle, near a small hill at the center of the valley. They had learned from watching their comrades die, positioning themselves to provide mutual support and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. It was a smart tactical decision that would make them much harder to attack. Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have called for backup or artillery support to deal with such a well-defended position. But these weren't normal circumstances. She was alone, flying a dead aircraft over enemy territory, with nothing but determination and a few remaining rockets to see her through. Sarah put the fighter into a steep dive, trading altitude for speed. Without engine power, this would be her final attack run. Everything depended on making it count. The defensive circle opened fire as soon as she came within range. Anti-aircraft shells burst all around the gliding fighter, filling the air with deadly fragments. One explosion was so close it shattered Sarah's canopy, filling the cockpit with wind and noise. She could taste blood from where flying glass had cut her face, but she held her course, diving straight toward the center of the defensive formation. The tanks below swiveled their turrets desperately, trying to track a target that was moving faster than their guns could traverse. Main gun shells whistled past the aircraft as the tank crews fired everything they had. At the last possible second, Sarah released all her remaining rockets simultaneously. 6 missiles streaked toward the clustered tanks like vengeful angels, each one finding its mark with devastating precision. The explosions came so close together they merged into one massive blast that lit up the entire valley. When the smoke cleared, the defensive circle had become a graveyard. 11 tanks lay scattered across the hillside, their crews either dead or fleeing on foot. The convoy that command had declared impossible to stop had been completely destroyed by one pilot and one damaged aircraft. Sarah pulled up from her final attack run, using the last of her altitude to clear the surrounding hills. Behind her, smoke columns rose from 35 burning vehicles, marking the end of the enemy advance. The mountain pass would remain secure, and her fellow soldiers would live to fight another day. But Sarah's own fight was far from over. With no engine and rapidly diminishing altitude, she had to find a place to set down her aircraft before gravity claimed its final victory. She spotted a wheat field about 2 miles ahead, its flat surface offering the best chance for a survivable landing. The approach was rough and uncontrolled. Without engine power or proper flight controls, Sarah could only guide the aircraft's descent, not truly control it. The fighter hit the wheat field hard, bouncing twice before skidding to a stop in a cloud of dust and scattered grain. Sarah sat in the wreckage for a long moment, hardly believing she was still alive. Around her, the cockpit was a maze of twisted metal and sparking electronics. Blood ran down her face from a dozen small cuts, and her left shoulder felt like it was on fire. But she was breathing, and that was more than she had expected 5 minutes ago. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the silence. Sarah looked up to see a convoy of friendly ground forces racing across the field toward her position. Her attack on the enemy tanks had cleared the way for their advance, allowing them to secure the valley much sooner than planned. As the first jeep reached her aircraft, Sarah heard familiar voices calling her name. Her squadron mates had come looking for her, probably expecting to find wreckage and a body. Instead, they found their friend sitting in the cockpit of a destroyed fighter, grinning through a mask of blood and dust. "Sarah, are you okay?" her wingman called as he ran toward the aircraft. Sarah tried to answer but found her voice wouldn't work. The adrenaline that had carried her through the battle was finally wearing off, leaving her shaky and exhausted. Instead of speaking, she simply held up one finger, then 3, then 5, 35, the number of enemy tanks she had destroyed against impossible odds. Later, in the field hospital, Sarah would learn that her one-woman assault had saved thousands of lives. The enemy convoy had been carrying enough firepower to devastate an entire division, and her destruction of the tanks had prevented a massacre at the mountain pass. Command would eventually court-martial her for disobeying direct orders, then immediately promote her and award her the highest decoration for valor. The contradiction was very military, but Sarah didn't mind. She had done what needed to be done, regardless of what the rulebook said about following orders, but all of that was still in the future. For now, Sarah Mitchell sat in her destroyed aircraft and watched the sun set over a valley filled with the smoking remains of 35 enemy tanks. She had proven that sometimes one person, in the right place at the right time with the determination to act, could change the course of history. Command had insisted no pilot could strike that convoy and survive. They had been half right. Sarah had struck the convoy, destroyed every single vehicle, and somehow lived to tell the tale. It was the kind of impossible story that would be told and retold for generations, inspiring future pilots to attempt their own impossible missions. As the medics helped her from the cockpit, Sarah took one last look at the burning wreckage in the distance. 35 tanks reduced to scrap metal by one pilot, who refused to accept the word impossible. It had been a good day's work,